I sung of chaos and eternal night, taught by the heavenly muse to venture down the dark descent, and up to reascend, though hard and rare. Thee I revisit safe and feel thy sovereign vital lamp, but thou revisit'st not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray, and find no dawn. So thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs, or dim suffusion veiled. Yet not the more cease I to wander where the muses haunt clear spring or shady grove or sunny hill, smit with the love of sacred song. But chief thee, Zion, and the flowery brooks beneath that wash thy hallowed feet, and warbling flow nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget those other two equaled with me in fate. So were I equaled with them in renown, blind Thamyris, and blind Maeonides, and Tiresias, and Phineus, prophets old. Then feed on thoughts that voluntary move harmonious numbers, as the wakeful bird sings darkling, and in shadiest covert hid tunes her nocturnal note. Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of evening, or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine. But cloud instead and ever-during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair presented with a universal blank of nature's works to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. So much the rather thou, celestial light, shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. Paradise Lost, Book 3. Welcome back to Professing Literature in the month of May in the year of grace 2021. I'm David Anderson. I'm an associate professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Oklahoma. I'm joined as ever by Eric Williams, my co-host and producer. And I think, Eric, we can say that we're pleased to be back in action once again, talking about one of my literary heroes, John Milton, and podcasting again for the first time in more than a few months.
Yeah. And how long has it been since we started?
The better part of a year.
Yeah.
We were only sort of sick of COVID quarantine back when we started, instead of now being desperately sick of it. But that was the summer of 2020. Over the next couple of months, I think we tried a few podcasting experiments that we liked and thought they were worth hanging on to. And so any listeners who jumped on board for our first episode of Macbeth and the episodes that followed may have noticed that they were dated, months before they were uploaded. And we were just seeing if we could get in the swing of this thing and if it would maybe work as a longer term project. And I think we liked what we did and thought it was worth pursuing. So now we're going to get in a regular rhythm.
Yeah, it's exciting.
This is, I should say, the podcast where we look at a short piece of important literature, mostly from the English tradition, but not necessarily always. From the canon of English literature, in order to see how it works and what it's telling us up close. So we don't bite off whole works in one bite, but we rather kind of get at some of the main ideas in a whole work sometimes through something small. Or in some cases, we'll look at the entirety of a short work, and that's what we're going to do today. So As of now, we are on the front foot with this bad boy. We are uploading episodes. We're going to have a hungry public that we've got to feed. And we're hoping for a schedule, I think. We'll see how it goes, Eric, of something like every 2 weeks. So count on us. A surprising number of people have listened to the first episode. And the fact that most of them are related to us, like, I don't think that's really the issue. There were still, like multiple human beings listening and approving.
Yes, it's been good. And we did have one download from France.
Oh, man.
So,
and that guy might not even have spoken English. We don't know.
Yeah,
and yet, there he is. And like, that's the kind of commitment you can't pay for.
Yes, exactly.
And it's the kind of commitment that advertisers are going to sit up and take notice. Because, if that guy is going to listen to a podcast on Macbeth, he might also want a Coca-Cola too. And so, I don't mind, I'm not above shilling for Coke. We could do a, 30-second ad read or something like that. I will say my brother-in-law offered me $10 if I would say that an episode was brought to you in part by Danny. And I'm giving him that one for free, just so he can see how he likes it and then think about it. I think I told him that $50 a mention was more reasonable, but that we could do like a package of 10, like 30 a piece or something. But Danny, now that you've soaked that up, I'll let you see if, I'm not going to charge you for that.
Yeah, but no more freebies.
No. And anyone else too. Like, it's cash on the barrel head if you want one of those mentions. But we are delighted. I've had a good feeling all day thinking that podcasting is back, because this is fun for me and it's fun for Eric. And hopefully we won't be the only ones who feel that way. But here we are today talking about a sonnet by Mr. John Milton. A sonnet is a short poem with a particular structure, and there's a little bit of variance in the structure, and I'm not going to get into this. I doubt this will be the last sonnet we talk about in Professing Literature. There are different types of sonnets with different rhyme schemes. In other words, the ending rhymes of the lines can rhyme in different patterns. Milton here is giving us a classic Petrarchan sonnet. So that means it's based on the rhyme scheme received originally, or more or less originally, from Francesco Petrarch of Italy, hundreds of years before Milton in the 14th century. So a sonnet, little song, sonetto in Italian, is a 14-line poem. There are some things that can be called sonnets that aren't 14 lines, but they are the rare exception that proves the rule. A sonnet, even if it's written today, generally tends to be 14 lines long. And in English, it's generally written in iambic pentameter, the meter of Shakespeare and Marlowe and of Milton's Paradise Lost, the de-dump, 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 10-syllable line. And I won't talk too much more about that. And then there is an intricate rhyme scheme. And a Petrarchan sonnet rhymes A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. Those are the first 8 lines. That's called the octave. And then the last 6 lines, called the sestet, can rhyme in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it would be something like C-D, C-D-E-E, or C-D-E, C-D-E. And there's a few other variations, but you have the important thing is a 14-line poem with an intricate rhyme scheme. So it's highly structured, and that means the poet is constrained, but one of the rules of art is constraint can equal liberation. And so the poet, by forcing his thought into this intricate rhyme scheme and this fixed meter and this set number of lines, has to obey all kinds of rules. But in doing so, sometimes he breaks or she breaks through to genius. And I think this poem is a brilliant sonnet, and we see that here. So the sonnet in its background some of our listeners will know, this very venerable form, already venerable by the time of the mid-17th century when Milton is writing it. This form was traditionally used for love poetry, and Petrarch's sonnets, of course, are love poetry. And the first 80 or 90 years' worth of English sonnets were mostly vehicles for love poetry. It's only at the beginning of the 17th century that this starts to shift. And Milton does not use sonnets to write about love. He uses sonnets to write about personal experience, about friendship, about politics, and maybe a couple of other topics. Milton only wrote about 20 sonnets in his career that we have, but he established himself as one of the great sonneteers in the history of English poetry. Some of his sonnets are up there with those of Shakespeare and Spenser and Sidney and Wordsworth and Keats as among the greatest sonnets in the English language. So the sonnet, as a small poem, allows for intense concentration on a particular issue. You can't write about everything. You can't put your whole life in a 14-line poem. You have to use this form when you want not to be expansive, but to be focused. You want to talk about an aspect of a romantic relationship. You can't say everything about the relationship or everything about the woman. If you want to say more about her, you have to write another sonnet. And so we have sonnet sequences, sometimes running into the hundreds, like Shakespeare, where the various aspects of love are treated. And so I often, in the classroom, compare a collection of sonnets, a cycle of sonnets, to a shoebox full of old photographs that your parents might have had in a dresser drawer, where here's one of mom and dad at a barbecue before they were married, here's one of them in the hospital when I was born, here's one on their wedding day, here's one of their first Christmas together. And you have these different snapshots capturing different moments at different angles. And Milton is writing one here, I think, about an experience, about a state that defined him, his blindness. So the sonnet allows this focus on a particular issue. But another thing the sonnet allows, and a good sonneteer always takes advantage of this, is that it allows him or her the opportunity to develop an idea, to wrestle with an idea, and, as we would say, to turn an idea, to all of a sudden in the middle of the sonnet or towards the end of the sonnet to swing things around. And so a good sonnet will usually not be linear in that the point that is made at the beginning of the sonnet is made at the end of the sonnet. You'll see that from time to time, but usually there's a shift and the poet will all of a sudden reconsider the subject. He will decide that he was wrong and that he didn't understand what he was initially talking about. Or he will come to a different conclusion at the end than we expected at the beginning. Or he will intensify things so that what he says at the outset, we realize, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what he's really feeling. And only at the end do we understand how hot his anger is, or how profound his frustration or passion is. Or sometimes he will use the turn of the sonnet to sum up, to really stand back and take a larger view of the issue. And in this sonnet, we're going to see Milton begins with a problem and he comes to a resolution of the problem. He comes to a kind of reconciliation that is personal. And so it's almost like poetry as therapy, as problem solving. And I don't mean therapy in a throwaway, self-indulgent sense, but the wrestling with an idea can allow for the clarity which brings about some kind of reconciliation, if that makes any sense.
So John Milton, I only know him from, obviously, Paradise Lost.
Yes.
It's that book that I bought and put it on my shelf and have never read it, but I plan to.
You're not one of my students, are you? Because I think I think that's a technique I've seen used in the past in my classroom from time to time.
Okay, well,
yeah. That's being unfair to my students. My students, especially in my Milton class, I think dig in. But yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
There are more than a few books on my shelf that have never been opened. But yeah.
I'd love to hear more about John Milton himself.
Well, he's an absolutely fascinating personality, a vivid, strong, controversial personality who lived a remarkable life in a remarkable era. Milton is fascinating. His biography is rich. He makes people very angry, but often for very different reasons. I won't say too much about him now because there's so much to say. You could have a whole year-long podcast just exploring Milton's life. Someone's probably done that. And so I'll just try to touch briefly on a few major points. He's born in December of 1608 in London. He's a Londoner, born in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral on a street with the wonderful antique name of Bread Street. Bread Street still exists in modern London, and if you go there today, you can see a plaque saying the statesman and poet John Milton was born on Bread Street. When I was last there, that plaque was attached to an H&M department store, so things have changed a little bit. But Milton was a brilliant young man from an early age. He showed enormous promise as a scholar. He studied at St. Paul's Grammar School, which was an elite grammar school for city boys, and he excelled there. He went off to Cambridge, to Christ's College, Cambridge, at the ripe old age of 14 years old, which was not unusual in the time. And he was there for 7 years, got his degree, studied deeply. He came to his father at the end of that time and said that he wasn't satisfied with his education, that he believed God was calling him to something and that he needed more learning, deeper learning. And so he asked his father to support him for an additional 7 years of private education that he would undertake himself, what he called his studious retirement. So for the next 7 years, he lived in the family house and just read. And then he considered himself educated. At this point, he's in his, where would he be? Now he'd be in his late 20s. And so he's beginning to spread his wings. He feels called to be a great poet, but politics intervenes. We're now in the late 1630s, and the great conflict that defined England for the next half century was beginning to bubble up between the king and his supporters and the supporters of Parliament. And so within a few years, what we refer to as the English Civil Wars, or sometimes the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, began. And Milton was a committed supporter of Parliament. Milton believed that for both political and religious reasons, that King Charles I was a tyrant who was trying to overthrow the traditional liberties of the English people, to stand in the way of their progress, and most importantly, was trying to quench true religion, the religious liberty that Milton believed was at the heart of the Protestant Reformation. So Milton focused in the 1640s on political and religious pamphleteering, on writing tracts and longer works in support of the parliamentary cause, and had throughout it all a governing conviction about the importance of liberty. Liberty is Milton's great theme. Liberty in political affairs, liberty with regard to ancient traditions, which he often believed were shackles that needed to be broken off, and liberty in spiritual affairs. Because true liberty, he believes, can only be achieved by total submission to God. And so by the end of the sort of hottest phase of the English Civil Wars, in 1648-49, this led Milton to become a strong supporter of Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentary general who took over the English government and who attempted to refound England as a republic, and who orchestrated the trial and execution of King Charles I. So Milton had this radical political position and this profound support of what Oliver Cromwell was doing, this new thing that Cromwell was doing. And he won for himself an important role in Cromwell's new government. He had the fantastic title of Secretary for Foreign Tongues because he was in charge of official correspondence, of translating it into Latin. However, there was a big problem. By 1652, after he'd only been on the job a little while, he had gone almost completely blind. His eyesight had begun failing several years before. It was almost certainly glaucoma. And by about 1652 or 53, he was completely blind, able to maybe see bright lights and shadows, but nothing more than that. And so he had to step away from his government post. He had to lay all that down and go into retirement. And the Cromwell government's loss was poetry's gain, because in his dark retirement, unable to see, Milton returned to poetry and threw himself into it. And so it is in that period that he begins writing Paradise Lost and the other so-called great poems, Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes, and also many shorter poems, including the one we're going to be talking about today. So today's poem is usually entitled On His Blindness. Sometimes it's titled with its first line, When I Consider How My Light Is Spent. Sometimes it's called Sonnet 16. And to really confuse us, sometimes it's called Sonnet 19. And I won't get into the reasons for all of those different titles. It was first published in 1673 in a collection of Milton's poems. It was only in the 18th century that it was entitled by an editor On His Blindness. And so some have argued that that's not the actual subject of the poem, that this is not a poem about Milton's blindness. It's rather a poem about broader anxieties about him having failed in his calling. Now, this is an impossible problem to solve one way or another, but we're going to treat it today as if it is about his blindness. That's not the only way to read it, but it's the way that I think is the most fruitful. There's always another way to read a poem. But this is, regardless, a deeply personal poem. We see this as an example, as I said, of poetry as an effort to explore deep pain and to find a way of reconciling it. And so we are invited in this poem to imagine that this is the way in which this poet found reconciliation. And so maybe this poem isn't about Milton's blindness, although that would raise larger questions for me, I think, if that were true. But I think it's going to make for a richer reading. So I'll begin by reading the poem, Sonnet 19. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor, light denied, I fondly ask? But patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, God doth not need either man's works or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. So the most famous line, of course, is the last one. And many of us will have heard versions of that phrase from time to time. They also serve who only stand and wait. And so this, of course, is where it comes from. This is a difficult poem. This is a far more difficult poem on the surface level than Seamus Heaney's beautiful poem about blackberry picking, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago. The diction is more archaic. The lines are heavily enjambed, meaning the sentences run over the line and stop in the middle of the following line. And Milton's allusions and images are sometimes difficult to untangle, especially for 21st century readers. So I'll try and work through it, and we'll see how we do. And then maybe at the conclusion, I'll come back to that beautiful passage from Paradise Lost that we began with and say a few words about that, because of course it's also on the theme of Milton's blindness. So start at the beginning, work to the end. The best advice I can give about reading poetry. Notice how he opens with the phrase, "when I consider." In other words, he's suggesting to us that this is a rumination, that he comes to a subject repeatedly, that he almost can't help coming to it, and that there's something that forces itself upon his attention. And then we immediately find out what it is that he considers. And it's that poignant, powerful phrase, "how my light is spent." So if this poem is indeed about Milton's blindness, it's interesting that he doesn't say how my sight is spent, but how my light is spent, which is much more powerful. The idea that he only has so much light in his lifetime, and he didn't have enough light to last him the entirety of his light, that it ran out, that the well was dry, and he still needed there to be water in it. So he says, my light rather than sight. And then he uses this word spent, that it's expended, that it's exhausted, that it has run out. So he has run out of light, and Milton is the great poet of light. Milton celebrates light in Paradise Lost repeatedly, in gorgeous passages that describe the beauty of light. Sometimes the devils, the rebel angels who have been expelled from heaven talk about the light that they are now cut off for, and they're longing for it. Milton loves color, and he loves descriptions of light. And it's easy to see why. It's because he now lives in the darkness, and he doesn't have any more. The only light that he has anymore is what he calls inner illumination, the light that comes through the imagination. But his light has been expended. And he tells us in the following line that he's only halfway through his life, ere half my days in this dark world and wide. So he has run out of light halfway through his life. And he hopes, I suppose, or he assumes his life will run more or less to the biblical 70 year and 70 years. But he won't be able to see for the rest of that time. And he is left in what he calls this dark world and wide, which is another highly resonant phrase. The world is already dark enough, but now for him it is a completely dark world. And it is also a wide world. It's a world, in other words, that is there to be explored, but that also has the threatening sense of something that one is lost in. And he is lost more than most of us because he can't see. It's worth mentioning, we know that as Milton was composing Paradise Lost, this enormous epic poem of something like 14,000 lines, apparently he made remarks in his lifetime that he would wake up in the morning and he wouldn't know if he was awake or not. He wouldn't know if he was awake or still dreaming because he couldn't see. And so in that kind of liminal state, that halfway state between waking and sleeping, he would begin to compose his day's work of Paradise Lost, lying in bed. And he would sort of rough out in his own mind about 100 lines worth of the poem. And then later in the day, when the day had properly begun, he would work with his secretary, his amanuensis, to sort of hammer it down on the page and work out all the kinks. But the poetry would come to him in his darkness, in this state where he doesn't know, at least sometimes he doesn't know if he's fully awake or still dreaming. But the world is dark for Milton. And he thinks about that, and he thinks about what it means, because it means things for him that are more than just practical, as it would for anyone who lost their sight. It goes to questions that are existential and spiritual. The third line, he talks about what he calls that one talent, which is death to hide. In the third line, he talks about that one talent, which is death to hide. Listeners who are familiar with the Bible will have a glimmer as to what that means. Milton is alluding here to the parable of the talents in the Gospels. Jesus tells this rather severe story about 3 servants, and I won't get into the details, but the servants are each given different amounts of money measured in talents in the ancient Mediterranean to take care of for their master who's going away on a trip. The first 2 servants each get a sum of money, several talents worth, and they put it to work. They invest it, and the money grows, and they more or less double what the master had given them. The third servant is only given a single talent, the smallest amount of money, but instead of venturing it, risking it, investing it, he buries it in the ground and hides it because he's afraid of losing it. And when the master comes back, he praises the first 2 servants who took the risk, and he condemns the third servant who buried the talent and didn't do anything with it. And of course, the talent of money suggests our individual gifts and talents that we have as people, as God's servants. And so Milton says he only has 1 talent. He's the servant with 1 talent, and we don't know what that means. Does he mean his intellectual prowess? Does he mean his ability with foreign languages, of which he was a master, knowing something like 8 or 10 languages, being one of the great Latinists of his generation in England? Does he mean his poetic gifts? And it must have been so hard to be a poet when you could not see in the 17th century, especially a poet who writes the incredibly dense, rich, elusive poetry that Milton writes. To not be able to see what you're doing on the page and work backwards and forwards and try experiments, but to have to talk it to a secretary. It must have been incredibly difficult. And in the early years of his blindness, it must have been terrifying for Milton to think about whether he really could accomplish his poetic mission with this perceived limitation hobbling him. And so he only has 1 talent. He's the servant with 1 meager talent, and he knows that it's death to hide it. He knows that it's condemnation for the talent not to be put to use, for the person not to at least try to exercise the gifts that God has given him. And so he says that that talent in the 4th line is lodged with me useless. Lodged with me useless. It's stuck with me, and it can't be employed. It can't be put to work, even though he says his soul is more bent, more desirous than ever to serve there with my Maker. And there's something very moving there and something very true, that someone who had missed the opportunity to use a gift might, when the opportunity is taken away, long all the more to be able to use that gift, right? Youth is wasted on the young, we are told. I'm old enough to feel the truth of that already. And the idea that an opportunity has passed by to employ a gift that one has used only intensifies the desire to exercise that gift. You know, it's too late for me to play shortstop at the pro level, Eric. And, oh, that I wasted my chance. That's cheapening what Milton's talking about, but hopefully in a way that makes the point. And so he wants to use this gift, but he can't, or he worries that he can't, and he worries about what that means, because Jesus, in the Gospels, so often associated quite naturally with compassion and grace, can also have these moments that are very severe. And the parable of the talents is one of those where Jesus appears as forbidding and maybe even terrifying in describing the wrath of the master on the servant who refuses to venture forth with the talent. He wants to serve his maker, he says, and present my true account, to display perhaps what I'm capable of, because if he returns, he may chide. There may be judgment. There may be condemnation for me if I don't do that. At the beginning of the following line, line 7, we hear Milton in conversation with himself, which is an interesting rhetorical technique. He asks, or he describes himself asking a rhetorical question. Doth God exact day labor, light denied? I fondly ask. And fondly here in the 17th century has the implication, for us to ask something fondly means maybe to ask it warmly or in a friendly way. But in the 17th century, it means foolishly. I foolishly ask. It's almost a kind of maybe little boy's question. Does God expect labor in the daytime when light is denied? I foolishly ask. Is that what he demands? And so he's already told us that the question is foolish, but just because we sometimes in our adult life have these little boy questions doesn't mean they're not real and that they don't come from a deep place of anxiety. And it's here that the poem turns. That word but is one of the ways a poet can use of signaling the turn of the poem. And so we just think of that as an everyday word, and maybe we don't notice it, but when a poet begins a statement with a but or a yet, we should pay attention, because this is the moment where Milton begins to swing things around and solve the problem that he began the poem with. And so the one who solves the problem, he suggests, is not him, but patience. The personified patience says something to him that is going to help him get through this. But patience to prevent that murmur soon replies. When he says prevent here, it has the meaning of forestall. Patience in order to forestall, to stifle that murmur soon replies. So patience is going to say something to shut Milton up. And the word murmur, it's a wonderful word. It has to remind us of the 16th and 17th century translations of the Old Testament, because the Israelites in the book of Exodus and the other books of the Pentateuch murmur, they complain, and it bothers God. And Milton is here accusing himself of murmuring. And so patience has to forestall his murmur. And so patience quickly replies, just as Milton is, or just as the speaker of the poem, I suppose I should say, to be more correct, just as the speaker of the poem begins to wallow, begins to feel sorry for himself, patience offers him counsel. And the counsel that patience offers is redemptive. He tells him, first of all, a hard but liberating truth, which is that God doesn't need you. God doth not need either man's works or his own gifts. So God does not require your work. The speaker of the poem has been assuming that he is in an economic relationship with God, where there is a quid pro quo. You do something for me, and I'll do something for you. But patience is telling the speaker that God doesn't work that way, that God is not in this relationship with the speaker because of what he can get out of it, that God is not counting on the speaker's investment yielding a big return on that talent, that he's not in an economy of quid pro quo. He's in a relationship defined by grace. And patience continues. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. So we have another biblical phrase here. Jesus saying that my yoke is easy, the yoke, the wooden frame that goes across the shoulders of an ox or a horse when it's drawing a plow or a cart. Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, so I don't crush those who follow me with impossible loads. And so Patience is reminding Milton that the yoke is light or is mild, and that the service God wants is not the service of performance, but the service of, how to put it, of patience, of course, but it's patience speaking, so we can probably find a better word, of acceptance, of willingness, that it is not in the performance that God is satisfied, but in the willingness to serve. It's not a matter of performance. It's a matter of fidelity, and it's a matter of trust that the one who believes himself cut off from his own gifts still holds value in the eyes of God. Patience continues. Patience really gets the last word or the last 6 lines in this poem. And Patience tells him his state is kingly. It's a simple statement. His state is kingly. God's state is infinite. And Patience continues saying that there are thousands who serve him and that they speed, a wonderful phrase, they speed and post or land and ocean without rest. And of course, these are the angels, a subject which Paradise Lost makes clear, fascinated Milton. The mighty spiritual servants of God are zipping around the cosmos at the speed of light. He doesn't depend on one man in England, blind or otherwise, for the outcome of his enterprise. He has an infinity of resources. And so the unlimited capacity of God means that the work, the labor of any one individual is not the crucial item, is not the crucial issue. And we have the wonderful concluding phrase that sums up the reconciliation he has come to. They also serve who only stand and wait. I love that word also. It's a key word, I think. It's not that those who can exercise their great gifts don't serve. It's not that that's not true service, but that included in the ranks of the true servants are those who can only stand and wait. Milton paints a powerful picture in those last few words. He could have used many phrases to conclude the poem, but he gives us an image of someone standing and waiting, suggesting availability, right? A person who is standing is ready, even though they are not in motion. A person waiting is not tuned out, is not indifferent. He is, if you like, on call. He is available, even though he's not in action. But to be in that posture of standing and waiting is a kind of service. This may have echoes of a culture where powerful people were surrounded by retainers and footmen who were standing and waiting, who were available to carry out orders, to carry messages, to perform tasks. But to do that is to do something valuable in God's eyes, because the criterion that matters here is not, again, performance, but willingness. So we see him wrestling with his own anxiety, the voice in the head of condemnation, but it is met with a voice of encouragement. And in that encouragement, he can end his poem. Now, I began the episode by reading a passage from Paradise Lost, which is on the same subject, if indeed Sonnet 19 is about Milton's blindness, and I think it is. This passage from Paradise Lost is explicitly about his blindness. In the first two books of Paradise Lost, Milton has begun the great story of Satan and his temptation of Adam and Eve. We begin in hell. The rebel angels have been thrown into hell. Satan has led them to disaster in the heavenly rebellion, but Satan rallies his troops. He tells them we will not stop fighting God, and he tells them that the new plan is for him to fly to this newly created planet called Earth and destroy God's new creation, Adam and Eve. And so the first two books of Paradise Lost tell that part of the story. And then at the beginning of book 3, Milton stops and he talks about himself. And Milton likes to talk about himself. And he tells us briefly, he reminds us of what he's narrated in books 1 and 2, Chaos and Eternal Night, that he's been taught by the heavenly muse to go down to hell and then to reascend up from hell. And he talks about his own state of being cut off from the light. He says that he feels the warmth of light as he emerges out of that darkness, but that he can't see it. A person who can't see could feel the warmth of the sun on their body, but they can't see it. And so that light does not come back to his eyes, which he says in a phrase that is almost chilling. They roll in vain to find the piercing ray. The eyes are moving, but they're moving uselessly because they'll never again be able to find that ray of light. That light, he says, is vital. It is vital. It is, vita. It is life-giving, that light. It is not merely useful, but it is connected to life itself. And he doesn't have it. He's cut off from it. He finds no dawn, he says. His eyes can't find the dawn. So thick a drop hath quenched their orbs. Nevertheless, he says, he is still searching. He's searching in his imagination, yet not the more cease I to wander where the muses haunt. So in his imagination, he is still moving. He is still looking, even though in his waking life he can't see. And then the reason this passage hits me so hard is because of the way in which, starting at line 40, about 2/3 of the way through the chunk I read to you at the beginning, he talks about what he's lost. And I'll reread those lines briefly. I think they're so beautiful. Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even, or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine. But cloud instead, and ever-during dark surrounds me from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair, presented with a universal blank of nature's works to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. So this is his situation. Every year, the world fills up with light again at the winter solstice. Slowly, gradually, the days get longer, the light increases as the seasons pass. But for him, the light does not return. For him, in the daily cycle, light does not return in the morning as it returns to everyone else. Evening and morning are sweet, he says, the sweet approach of even or morn. Both the dawn and the dusk are beautiful, the light fading from the world or the light filtering into the world, but he gets neither of them. He doesn't see the vernal bloom, the flower in the springtime, and he doesn't see the rose in the summer. He doesn't see, and we have this effective listing of accumulation that's going to end with a bang. He doesn't see the vernal bloom or summer's rose or flocks or herds or human face divine. And that last phrase is the killer. the beauties of the natural world, the flowers in spring and summer, the flocks of sheep, the herds of cattle grazing, all of these are beautiful, all of these are meaningful. But of course, it's the last one that is the most important, the human face divine. He doesn't say people, aside from the fact that that wouldn't be very poetic or very Miltonic. He doesn't say other men and women. He says the human face divine. Why does he stress the face and what is divine in it? Well, the face is where the person is manifest in the body. The face is where the human being becomes more than an animal, which is not a denigration to animals. And the face, by implication, is where the imago Dei, the divine image, is imprinted, where you can see in another person's eyes the soul, because you see the self, you see their reason, you see their capacity to communicate with you. And so it's a stunning phrase, the human face divine, because it reminds the reader that from Milton's Christian perspective, the human being bears the image of God, meaning that every time you look at another person, you have the opportunity to see the one who made them in them, which is not to say that the person is simply an avatar for the divine or simply a kind of signpost pointing to the divine, but that the dignity of the human being is to reflect the divine creator. And to be blind is to be cut off from that. Now, Milton understands that there are other ways of access to God. He understands that there are other ways of appreciating human beings, the voice, things like that. But something about the fact that he is cut off from the face, that if you're paying attention, every face you meet can attest to the one who made it and can be a glimpse of the one who made it, is just extraordinary. And so blindness for him is not just a functional problem, and I'm certain that's true of I think I said this already, but of anyone who wrestles with a disability like that. It's not just a matter of having a harder time doing things. It's a fact that is necessarily going to prompt one to ask larger questions about what it means to be human. Milton's solution to this in his sonnet was to understand that simply being was sufficient, that the doing is not what God is interested in so much as the being, or at least the being within willingness, is what mattered. That God created him first not to do, but to be. And so that was how he found his reconciliation in that poem. And Paradise Lost, this passage from Paradise Lost, invites God to shine inward, he says. There is a belief, and it's reiterated several times throughout Paradise Lost, that the very fact that Milton is in darkness may mean that the inside of him could be lit up with something else, or at least there is stirred in him the desire that that would be so. And I think that's where we'll leave it. Well, Eric, I ate up a lot of time at the beginning faffing around about Milton and about sponsorships and about the English Civil War and the sonnet form and a bunch of other things. So if any listeners have survived till the end of this one, we will just thank them for joining us, invite them to come back next time. The topic will not be Milton's blindness. It will be something else. But thank you, everyone, and farewell from Eric and myself. Until the next time.